Beneath the scorching sun of the desert, a strange silence filled the air, one that felt almost unnatural, as if the wind itself dared not speak. In the midst of this stillness, a story was unfolding that would echo through centuries. It was the story of an arrogant man who believed his wealth could buy his fate, who mocked the messenger of God to his face, and who, without lifting a sword, would still be defeated in the most humiliating way. This was the tale of a man whose name would be immortalized in the Qur'an, not in honor but in disgrace, a name that the entire world would recite until the end of time: Abu Lahab. The sun had barely risen over Makkah when the narrow streets began to hum with activity. Merchants rolled up the covers of their stalls, women drew water from the wells, and the cries of traders competed with the bleating of goats. It was the same city, the same rhythm, but for some, the day would carry an undercurrent of tension. Word had spread quickly in recent weeks. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the man known for his truthfulness and trustworthiness, had claimed to be the messenger of Allah. To the poor and the humble, this was a light in the darkness. But to the proud leaders of Quraysh, it was a direct threat to their power. Among those leaders, no one took the claim more personally than Abu Lahab, the Prophet's own uncle. His given name was Abd al-Uzza, but his fiery temper and ruddy complexion had earned him the nickname Father of Flame. To him, Muhammad's mission was not just a religious matter, it was an insult and embarrassment to his family. That morning, Abu Lahab moved with a sense of purpose. His steps were heavy, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of his nephew. He had heard the whispers that Muhammad was calling for a gathering, perhaps even on the hill of Safa. Abu Lahab's heart burned, not with curiosity, but with anger. How dare his own blood shame the gods of Quraysh? How dare he challenge the traditions that had stood for generations? By midday, the people began to gather at Safa. The hill was a familiar meeting place, its rocky slopes overlooking the Kaaba in the distance. Muhammad stood there, his voice calm but carrying with an authority that silenced the crowd. He began with a question, one that would have seemed harmless in any other context. If I told you there was an army behind this hill, ready to attack, would you believe me? There was no hesitation in the answer. Yes, we have never known you to lie. The crowd murmured in agreement. Muhammad had always been the truthful one, the man people trusted with their most valuable possessions, the one whose word was as solid as stone. Then came the words that would divide the city. Then know that I am a warning to you before a severe punishment comes upon you. I call you to worship Allah alone and to abandon the gods you serve besides Him. For a moment, there was silence. Some faces showed curiosity, others confusion. And then Abu Lahab's voice cut through the air like a blade. May you be ruined all day. Is this why you gathered us? His words dripped with scorn, each syllable meant to belittle and humiliate. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some smirked, others frowned. Abu Lahab turned to leave, confident that his interruption had undone the moment. But what he did not know was that in the unseen world, a response was already descending, one that would ensure his insult was not forgotten. Soon after the revelation came to Muhammad, perish the hands of Abu Lahab, and perish he. His wealth will not avail him, nor what he earned. He will burn in a fire of flame, and his wife too, the carrier of firewood. Around her neck is a rope of palm fiber. The words spread like fire through Makkah. For the first time in history, a man's name was etched into divine scripture, not in honor, but in eternal condemnation. Abu Lahab's pride had met a force greater than his wealth, his influence, or his temper. The market chatter buzzed with questions. Some wondered if the verse was too direct, too bold. Others whispered in awe, What kind of confidence must Muhammad have to speak so fearlessly against his own uncle, knowing the consequences? That evening, Abu Lahab returned to his home, but there was no comfort within its walls. His wife, Jamil, equally proud and sharp-tongued, fanned the flames of his rage. Together they plotted ways to harm Muhammad, not only physically, but to destroy his reputation. But no matter what they tried, the words of the revelation echoed in the alleys of Makkah, in the whispers of the night, in the recitation of every believer. And so in the heart of Makkah, under the watch of the Kaaba and the desert stars, the fate of Abu Lahab was sealed, not by a sword, but by a verse that would outlast every stone and every empire. The days following the revelation against Abu Lahab were restless for the city of Makkah. The desert air carried with it a tension that could be felt in the marketplaces, in the gatherings of Quraysh elders, and even in the private courtyards of the wealthy. The Kaaba still stood at the heart of the city, surrounded by idols of stone and wood, but now there was a voice calling for their destruction, one that could not be silenced by threats or ridicule. For Abu Lahab, the verse revealed about him was a humiliation beyond measure. It was not just an insult from a man, it was a decree from the very God Muhammad claimed to speak for. His name, forever tied to words of doom, had become a topic of whispered discussion in the streets. Merchants spoke of it while arranging their goods, women repeated it while drawing water, and travelers carried the story to distant places. Wherever the name Abu Lahab was mentioned, the divine condemnation followed. Abu Lahab could not tolerate such disgrace. In his mind, this was more than a personal feud. It was a battle for the honor of his family and the traditions of Quraysh. He began to make his presence felt at every gathering where Muhammad preached. Whenever his nephew spoke of the oneness of Allah, Abu Lahab's voice would rise in mockery, twisting the words, sowing doubt, and laughing loudly enough for all to hear. His wealth and influence gave weight to his scorn, and many in Quraysh, either out of loyalty to their idols or fear of losing Abu Lahab's favor, followed his lead. But it was not only Abu Lahab who joined in the campaign against the Prophet. His wife, Jamil, was equally relentless. Known for her sharp tongue and quick temper, she carried news and gossip like weapons. In the quiet hours before dawn, when most of Makkah still slept, she would scatter thorns and sharp branches along the paths she knew Muhammad walked, hoping to injure him. She believed her actions were hidden, but the eyes of the Almighty see all. Her malice was so constant that she earned the title mentioned in the Revelation, the carrier of firewood, a symbol of the fuel she brought to the flames of enmity and slander. One evening, after a day of trading in the markets, Abu Lahab sat among other elders of Quraysh in a shaded courtyard. The conversation turned, as it often did, to Muhammad and his growing number of followers. "If we let him continue," Abu Lahab said, his voice low but intense, "he will tear this city apart. The tribes will abandon us, the pilgrims will stop coming, and our gods will be forgotten." His words struck a chord with the men around him, for Makkah's wealth and prestige rested heavily on the yearly pilgrimage and the veneration of its idols. Another elder leaned forward. "What do you propose?" Threats have not silenced him, and his followers seemed to grow more devoted with each passing day. Abu Lahab's lips curled into a thin smile. "If threats are not enough, then we will use shame. We will brand him a liar before his people. We will spread stories that will make him appear mad." From that day, Abu Lahab and those close to him worked tirelessly to poison the minds of Makkah against the Prophet. They called him a sorcerer, a poet, a madman, anything that might turn people away from listening to his message. Yet despite their efforts, Muhammad continued to preach, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. The poor and the oppressed listened, finding in his words a hope they had never known. The tension between Abu Lahab's household and the Prophet's followers deepened with each encounter. On one occasion, Muhammad was walking near the Kaaba when Abu Lahab crossed his path. Without a word, Abu Lahab spat toward the ground in front of him, his eyes locked on his nephew with open contempt. The Prophet did not return the insult. He simply walked past, his steps calm and deliberate, as though guided by something far greater than the petty rage of men. This quiet dignity infuriated Abu Lahab even more. How could a man so publicly cursed by Quraysh's leaders, so constantly ridiculed, still walk with such peace? How could he stand alone against the power of the city and not falter? Jamil, too, sought her own moment of vengeance. One morning, she stormed into the vicinity of the Kaaba carrying a large stone, her face twisted with rage. Word had reached her of the verses in which she herself was mentioned, described as one who would face a rope of palm fiber around her neck in the hereafter. To her, this was unbearable. She intended to confront Muhammad directly, to curse him in front of all. But when she arrived, she found herself strangely unable to see him, though he stood there speaking to others. Her eyes, as if veiled by something unseen, could not find him. Confused and humiliated, she left in frustration, muttering threats under her breath. In the months that followed, the division within Makkah grew sharper. Families were split, friendships strained. The new faith that Muhammad preached did not recognize the social hierarchies that men like Abu Lahab relied on. It called slaves and masters, men and women, rich and poor, all to stand as equals before Allah. For those whose power was built on pride and control, this was a dangerous idea. Abu Lahab watched as even some of the youth of Quraysh, drawn by the truth of Muhammad's message, began to leave the idols behind. His frustration boiled over into acts of open hostility. On one occasion, when he learned that his own sons were betrothed to the daughters of Muhammad, he ordered them to sever the ties immediately, turning what should have been bonds of kinship into yet another wound in the family. Still, the verses of the Qur'an continued to be revealed, each one a challenge to the false gods and the injustice that sustained them. And no matter how loudly Abu Lahab shouted in the marketplaces, no matter how many thorns Jamil scattered in the night, the words spread, softly at first, then more firmly, like a flame that no water could extinguish. The streets of Makkah, once indifferent to the call of a lone man, now buzzed with the sound of debates, arguments, and secret discussions about the one God. The Kaaba still stood as it always had, but in the hearts of some, the idols were already beginning to crumble. Abu Lahab felt it, like sand slipping through his fingers, and it drove him deeper into the shadows of his own rage. The nights of Makkah seemed darker in those days, though the moon shone as it always had. In the narrow alleys, whispers traveled like shadows, slipping between the doors of houses and curling around the pillars of the Kaaba. Abu Lahab's name was on every tongue, but never with the reverence he once commanded. The revelation had marked him, and no matter how loudly he shouted or how ruthlessly he tried to silence it, the words would not die. They were repeated in the gatherings of the believers, in the homes of the curious, and even by travelers who came from far lands. Abu Lahab's pride could not bear it. He, the uncle of Muhammad, had been reduced to a symbol of divine wrath. It was not just the words that burned him, it was the knowledge that he could not change them. The verses had a strange power. No matter how he tried to mock them, his voice trembled with a frustration he could not hide. He had confronted Muhammad in public. He had insulted him before the Quraysh. But the messenger's calm response, his quiet recitation of the revelation, had pierced him deeper than any sword. Jamil, his wife, was no less consumed by fury. She could not walk through the marketplace without hearing the verse that condemned her as the carrier of firewood. The imagery gnawed at her. Was she to be remembered as a servant of the flames, a gatherer of fuel for her own torment? Her pride would not allow her to remain silent. She took to the streets herself, carrying thorny branches and scattering them in Muhammad's path before dawn, hoping to injure his feet as he walked. She would spit curses when she passed by the house of Khadijah, her voice shrill and venomous. One morning, Jamil stormed through the marketplace with a stone pestle in her hand, her eyes wild with rage. She had heard that Muhammad was sitting near the Kaaba, speaking to a small group of his followers. Her steps were quick, each one echoing her determination to humiliate him. But when she reached the Kaaba, she looked around and could not see him, though he sat in plain sight. It was as if an unseen veil had been drawn between them. Unable to find him, she turned away, muttering curses, her anger unresolved. The opposition from Abu Lahab and his wife grew harsher. Whenever Muhammad would stand to speak, Abu Lahab would follow him, shouting to the people, "Do not listen to him. He is a liar, a madman." He would throw dust into the air, as though trying to obscure the messenger's words. Some of the Quraysh would laugh, others would join in the insults, but there were always a few who watched silently, their hearts stirred by the calm dignity with which Muhammad endured the abuse. It was during this time that the boycott of the Muslims began. The leaders of Quraysh, angered by the growing number of Muhammad's followers, conspired to isolate them completely. They wrote a pact, sealing it inside the Kaaba, agreeing that no one would trade with, marry, or speak to the Muslims until they abandoned Muhammad. Abu Lahab not only agreed to the pact, he rejoiced in it. While some members of Quraysh hesitated to enforce the boycott on their own relatives, Abu Lahab stood firm, even turning away his own kin who followed Islam. The Muslims withdrew to the valley of Abu Talib, a narrow, rocky pass on the outskirts of Makkah. For 3 long years, they endured hunger so severe that their cries echoed through the night. The children wept from emptiness, their mothers unable to soothe them. Leaves from the trees became their food, and scraps of leather were boiled to soften them enough to chew. From a distance, Abu Lahab heard these cries, but his heart remained hard as stone. He would walk past the marketplace and tell merchants not to sell food to Muhammad's people, even if they offered twice the price. There were times when strangers from outside Makkah would come with grain, unaware of the boycott. Abu Lahab would approach them, whispering that their goods should not go to Muhammad's followers, that to do so would bring them disgrace. His presence loomed like a shadow over every attempt to bring relief to the starving believers. Yet even in the darkness of the boycott, whispers of dissent began to stir among the Quraysh. Not all could bear the cruelty for long. Some secretly smuggled food to the Muslims, slipping it through under the cover of night. A few began to question whether this was truly the way of their forefathers. But Abu Lahab remained unmoved. For him, this was not merely about religion. It was about crushing Muhammad completely, so that his message would vanish from memory. When at last the boycott ended, its agreement destroyed by termites that had eaten away the parchment in the Kaaba, there was relief among the Muslims, but also deep loss. Khadijah, the Prophet's beloved wife, and Abu Talib, his steadfast protector, both passed away soon after. The grief was heavy, and Quraysh saw it as an opportunity to intensify their opposition. Abu Lahab, sensing the absence of Abu Talib's protection, became even more brazen in his attacks. But then came an unexpected twist. Upon Abu Talib's death, the leadership of the clan of Banu Hashim passed to Abu Lahab himself. In the customs of the Arabs, this meant he was now responsible for the safety of his clansmen. Muhammad. For a brief moment, the hostility seemed to pause. Abu Lahab even told Muhammad he could continue his mission without fear of harm. It was not compassion that moved him. Perhaps it was a flicker of tribal duty or a calculation that open aggression might harm his reputation. Yet this fragile truce did not last. Not long after, Abu Lahab overheard Muhammad reciting verses that spoke of the fate of the disbelievers. His temper, always near the surface, erupted once more. The words were too much for his betrayal to bear, and the enmity returned with greater force. The protection was withdrawn, and the messenger of Allah was again left vulnerable to the cruelty of Quraysh. From that point on, Abu Lahab's name became inseparable from opposition to the truth. Wherever the Prophet traveled in Makkah, Abu Lahab was not far behind, hurling insults, stirring the crowd, twisting every word to turn people away. In the gatherings of the Quraysh, he would boast of how he would ruin Muhammad's mission. He still clung to the belief that his wealth and influence could shield him from any consequence, that the God Muhammad spoke of could not touch him. But the verse had already been revealed, and every passing day only brought him closer to its fulfillment. Even in moments of laughter, when he felt triumphant in his schemes, the murmurs of the people carried the sound of those words. Perish the hands of Abu Lahab, and perish him. And though he raged against them, he could not erase them. They had been written not by mortal hands, but by the decree of the one whose word never fails. The final stretch of their journey carried with it an air of inevitability, as though every step they took had already been written long before their feet touched the earth. The dust beneath their sandals was the same dust that had been trampled by countless generations before them, yet it felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of divine decree. The wind moved with a strange restlessness, swirling around them in unseen currents, sometimes whispering faintly, sometimes roaring like a distant storm. They pressed on, their hearts both steady and unsettled, for they knew the end was near. But what that end would hold, none could say for certain. As they drew closer to their destination, the world around them seemed to shift in a subtle yet undeniable way. The sunlight dimmed not because of the setting sun, but as though a veil had been drawn across the sky. Shadows lengthened even when the sun was directly overhead, and the air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath feel more deliberate. In the distance, shapes flickered along the horizon, unfamiliar silhouettes that seemed both natural and unnatural at once. Some appeared like towering mountains that swayed as though alive, while others darted quickly and vanished before the eye could focus. Whether these were illusions born of exhaustion or signs of something far greater, no one dared to voice aloud. They reached a narrow valley flanked by jagged cliffs on either side, their dark surfaces marked by ancient lines and strange carvings that no one recognized. The air inside this passage was unnervingly still, carrying no scent of life, no rustle of animals or whisper of leaves. It was as though nature itself was holding its breath, watching them pass. A single bird called from somewhere far above, its cry sharp and short, before silence reclaimed the land. Here, words were scarce. Each person carried their thoughts like burdens, too heavy to be spoken. The leader of the group walked with a quiet certainty, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, though his eyes flickered often to the sky. It was as though he was listening for something beyond the range of human hearing, a signal perhaps, or a command. The others followed him not only out of trust, but because they felt the same pull, as though their souls were being guided by an invisible thread. And though their bodies ached, they did not slow. The unspoken urgency pressed them forward. By nightfall, they emerged from the valley into an open plain. Here the wind returned, carrying with it a strange, almost metallic scent. The ground was cracked and dry, but beneath the surface, faint vibrations could be felt. Subtle pulses like the heartbeat of the earth itself. They made camp without fire, for none dared to light one. The sky above was strangely lit, not with stars, but with shifting bands of pale light that danced silently, weaving patterns across the heavens. The youngest among them stared in awe, but the older ones exchanged wary glances, for they had heard stories of such skies, stories that spoke of endings and beginnings colliding. In the silence of the night, a faint sound began to grow. At first it was distant, like a murmur from beyond the horizon, but gradually it swelled into something deep and resonant, vibrating in their chests. It was not a sound made by man or beast, but something older, something that seemed to come from the very bones of creation. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes low and rumbling, sometimes sharp and piercing. The leader stood and turned toward the sound, his eyes reflecting both fear and recognition. Without a word, he began walking toward it, and the rest followed, unable to resist. The journey stretched on through the darkness until they reached the source. Before them lay a vast expanse, unlike anything they had seen. The ground was smooth and glimmering faintly, as though carved from polished stone, yet it pulsed with a dim light from beneath, as if alive. In the center stood a towering structure, blacker than the night around it, its surface absorbing every trace of light. The sound they had followed seemed to emanate from within its depths, each note a vibration that shook the soul. They approached slowly, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the still air. At the base of the structure, a single opening yawned before them, dark and narrow. A faint wind flowed out from it, cool yet heavy, carrying scents and whispers they could not place. One by one they stepped inside. The air grew colder, and the sound became all-encompassing. Not just heard, but felt in every fiber of their being. The passage led them deeper, winding downward in a slow spiral, until the walls themselves began to shimmer faintly with symbols they did not recognize. Symbols that seemed to move when looked at directly. At last they emerged into a vast chamber. In the center stood a pedestal, upon which rested an object unlike anything they had ever seen. It glowed softly, but not with light. Rather, it seemed to shine with presence, as though it was not meant to be seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. The leader stepped forward, and as his hand neared the object, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was deeper than any they had ever known. So complete, it seemed to swallow their thoughts. And then, without warning, a voice spoke, not in the air around them, but inside each of their minds. It was a voice that carried neither warmth nor malice, only truth, pure and unyielding. The words it spoke were not in any language they knew, yet they understood them perfectly. It told them of the end that was coming and the choice that must be made. It told them that what they carried was not for themselves, but for those yet to come. It told them that the path ahead would demand everything they had left to give. They listened in silence, each feeling the weight of the message settle upon their hearts. When the voice faded, they knew there was no turning back. They turned as one and began the slow ascent back to the surface, the air growing warmer with each step. Above, the strange light in the sky still danced, but now it seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if marking the path ahead. The journey was not over, but the world they would return to would not be the same as the one they had left.